All right, our topic for today's lecture is due process of law. Due process of law. And so we're going to look at kind of four main areas. First off, we're going to define due process. Talk about what it is, where it comes from. The second thing we're going to do is take a look at, okay, well, what are the actual rights that are part of due process? Then we'll take a look at some limits to due process, a couple areas where due process can be limited, and then we're going to talk about some criticisms about due process. All right? So let's start off with Roman numeral 1. We're talking about due process. What is it? Where does it come from? Okay? So first thing we want to do is define due process. So, due process is the principle that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures and safeguards. I'll repeat that definition. Due process is the principle. We're talking about PLE, right? Not like the person who runs the school. The principle that nobody can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without fair legal procedures and safeguards. Basically, your due process rights put restrictions on the government in order to protect your rights. You put restrictions on the government in order to protect your rights. So important to understand, right? Due process doesn't say the government can't take away your life, liberty, or property. Okay? The government very clearly can take away your life, liberty, and property. We have states that execute criminals. That's taking away their life. Right? The government can take away your liberty. It can throw you in jail. It can take away your property. But what it cannot do is do those things without a fair legal process. Right? So where does it come from? Well, like we talked about back in Unit 1, when we looked at where a number of our ideas came from, we can trace it back to the Magna Carta, right? Which goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, back into the 1200s. What I'll do is I'm going to read to you what it actually says in Magna Carta. Now, don't try to get all of this down, because we're going to go back and look at it and sort of break it down and say, okay, here's what it actually says in Magna Carta. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals, or by the law of the land. Okay, let's go back and break that down. Again, this is the Magna Carta, goes back 800, 900 years. We're drawing on it to figure out the legal rights we want our citizens to have. All right. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned. Okay, so again, first off, we're saying, who can't do this?
Anyone?
The government.
Specifically the government. We're saying, okay, so the Magna Carta gives us the idea that the government cannot No free man shall be seized or imprisoned. Means what?
Put in jail.
Thrown in jail. So the government can't throw you in jail. Right. Or stripped of his rights. Take away your rights. Or possessions, belongings, or outlawed or exiled.
Kicked out.
Yeah, kind of like banished, right? So they can't like kick you out of the country. They can't banish you, kick you out. Or deprived of his standing in any other way. I can kind of leave that one. It's not as specific. Nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so.
It's not like force you to tell a lie or something.
They
No,
can't
not
force
quite.
you to admit that you've done something wrong.
Doesn't say anything about that. Nor will we proceed with force against him.
So they can't like arrest him.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah, who would proceed with force against you?
Police.
The cops, the police, right? So basically what they're saying there is send the police to arrest you. Except, okay, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. So they're saying the government can't do any of this stuff unless it's done in what sort of manner?
With a fair trial.
A legal manner, right? It has to be done in a legal manner. And Abby, you're absolutely right that they specifically mention there, right, that that will include a trial. Okay? Says the lawful judgment of his peers. They're saying, look, you know, we're not just the government can't just do this stuff. It's got to follow the rules. It's got to give you rights to legal protection. So we borrowed from the Magna Carta. Now the Magna Carta was England, right? So like the Magna Carta doesn't apply in this country. So in our country, specifically, where do your due process rights come from? Where are they written? In the Constitution, okay? And so in the U.S. Constitution, we find due process specifically in the Fifth Amendment. And it shows up again in the 14th Amendment. So important we put it in twice. Now, why would we feel the need to put it in twice?
Because there could be two different, like, categories of where it's conducted.
You're very, very close. Remember, early on in our country's history, the Supreme Court said the Bill of Rights applied to what level of government?
national.
Just the national.
And then they changed.
Okay? So they said, well, the Fifth Amendment, right, that's part of the Bill of Rights. The Supreme Court said, you know, really the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government, so, you know, we can't do anything about the states.
Is that the reason why the fifth was there? Because it was in the national section?
Okay? Well, the Fifth was there because it was in the Bill of Rights, one of the first things that gets added in the Constitution. The 14th comes back and restates due process rights, and it specifically attaches them to the states. It says the states cannot violate your due process rights either. Yeah, the states have to protect your due process rights too. And so that opened up the door for the Supreme Court to come back later and say, well, you know what? That applies the Fifth Amendment to the states. Maybe we can apply the other amendments to the states as well. So this kind of opened up the door for saying, well, hang on a minute, the Bill of Rights doesn't only apply to the national government. It applies to the states as well. So the national government has to protect your freedom of speech, but so do states. The national government has to protect your due process rights, and so do the states. Okay? So let's move on to Roman numeral 2. What are due process rights? Let's go over specifics here. So we know some things the government's not supposed to do unless they follow proper legal safeguards. So let's talk specifically about what those safeguards are, what those legal rights are. All right. So due process is basically there to protect suspects who are in the legal system or the criminal justice system. So first off, your due process rights include something called habeas corpus, which basically means that suspects of a crime must be told of the charges against them.
Can you repeat that?
Habeas corpus means that suspects of a crime must be told of the charges against them. So put another way, you can't just throw somebody in jail and leave them there. They have to be brought before a judge who will say, this is what you're being charged with, this is when your trial is going to be. Right? This prevents the government from locking you up and throwing away the key. I feel like that's the line of a song, and I just can't figure out what it is. I thought of that earlier too. I was like, this is the line of a song.
What did you say?
Something about locking you up and throwing away the key. I know it's in a song that's on the radio right now. I just can't think of what it is.
It has to be.
It must be.
It's cheesy enough.
It's so trite and cliched. Okay, but here we're literally talking about locking somebody up and throwing away the key, right? That this prevents the government from doing that, okay? All right, second thing. We know this because we just did several cases about it. Suspects are protected against unreasonable search and seizure. So we just did several real-life Supreme Court cases where we looked at this issue, the Fourth Amendment. Terry v. Ohio, where the guy got patted down on the street. New Jersey v. TLO, where the student's purse got searched. Mapp v. Ohio, where the police busted into her house without a warrant. All of those dealt with unreasonable search and seizure. All right, third. During an arrest, suspects must be informed of their rights.
That's like the right to remain silent.
Right, so yeah, good. Think of police shows, right? As soon as they are putting someone in the cuffs, the detective is telling them, you have the right to remain silent, right? So when we're saying that you have to be informed of your rights, that includes the right to remain silent.
Doesn't it also include like the right to a lawyer?
Bingo, good, right? Because think about it, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one will be provided for you. Right? So right to an attorney is included in there too.
But is an attorney the same thing as a lawyer?
An attorney is a lawyer. Those are the same
Okay.
thing. Interchangeable.
Then I call him a lawyer.
Yep. Lawyer makes more sense to you, put lawyer. So the police tell you of these things when you are arrested. Okay. And these come from, what is that called when the cops read you that? You might know? Mirandize you, or they read you the Miranda warning. They tell you your Miranda rights. Okay? And that is where it comes from. It comes from this case called Miranda v. Arizona. Which was a Supreme Court case in which the court said police have to read these warnings during an arrest. And so that's why we call them Miranda rights. Right? It's, the guy's name was Miranda. And in this case, he felt like his rights had been violated. He was basically interrogated, was not told of the rights that he had. He was interrogated, admitted to the crime, and then later on he finds out, well, hang on a minute, I didn't know I didn't have to say anything. I thought I had to. I didn't know I could keep my mouth shut. And so he said, I feel like my rights have been violated. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. And they said, cops, you have to read this warning to people when you arrest them. You have to inform them of their rights.
Because otherwise they can do something that's going to make the situation worse than it needs to be.
Right, and so they're saying you got to let people know what the rights are. And if you don't, then anything they say can't be used. It's basically an illegal search, right? They're saying you can't use that against them. So, let's continue. Other rights. Suspects have the right to defend themselves in court. You have the right to defend yourself in court, and that includes things like you have the right to face your accuser. You have the right to a trial by a jury. All of those have to do with being able to defend yourself in court. Suspects are protected against what is called double jeopardy. Any idea what double jeopardy means? Philip?
Isn't it like self-incriminating? Or is that something totally different?
Nope, that's a different. Right, self-incrimination gets to this idea of you have the right to remain silent.
Oh.
Okay? And that during a trial, you don't have to take the stand if you're the one who's accused, right? You don't have to say anything that might incriminate you. So if you choose not to take the stand, you have that right.
Does that mean they can't be persecuted twice for the same crime?
No, it's when the point values are double and there's 2 daily doubles.
No.
Duh.
No. I just
You're
looked it
exactly
up
right.
in the dictionary.
Okay? You're exactly right. That is what it means. Basically, if you are found innocent of a crime, you cannot then be charged for that same crime again, is what double jeopardy means. If you're found innocent of a crime, you cannot be tried for the same crime again. Mm-hmm.
It's 2:40 and soccer's supposed to be first.
Yes, so I'm going to post this video and you can just get the last bit of the video.
Okay, thank you.
Okay? Good luck.
Thank you.
So what double jeopardy, this protection against double jeopardy does is it prevents the government from basically just, trying you for a crime, you're found innocent, and then they just arrest you and try you again, right? And they just keep arresting you and putting you on trial until finally a jury finds you guilty, right?
Now, if there was a doubt in, say, persecution, if there was a doubt among the jury, that doesn't count, does it? Like,
You have to be found innocent. So if it's a hung jury,
Then you're automatically
then
tried.
you could be tried again. Okay, because a hung jury means the jury just couldn't decide if you were innocent or guilty. So if you're found innocent, if you're cleared of the crime, you can't be arrested and tried again,
For the same
right? But if it's a hung jury, meaning they couldn't decide, they're like hopelessly deadlocked, then you could be arrested and tried again. Now, in the movie we're going to start watching tomorrow, which relates specifically to the right to an attorney, a case called Gideon v. Wainwright, it relates to this, but he's going to argue in the movie that he should not be put on trial again because it's double jeopardy, but he's actually wrong because he was never found innocent. He gets what's called a retrial. Right?
I did have one other question
Mhm.
about that. So does that also mean that if, like, say, some new evidence is like found, or there's like a new witness or something like that, and you were found innocent, does that?
Cannot be tried twice for the same crime.
Okay.
Now, if it's a different crime, that's different.
Yeah.
But if it's you can't be tried twice for the same crime. All right, one more for due process rights that I want you guys to have down, and it has to do with people who are actually convicted, right? They're actually convicted and sent to jail. People who are convicted of a crime continue to have due process rights, and they have the right to access what is called the parole system. And they are protected against cruel and unusual punishment.
In certain situations, can parole be banned to them, or can they not?
Yes, it can be denied,
Yeah.
but you have to have access to it. Basically, you have the right to ask for parole. Doesn't mean you're going to get it. It just means you have the right to apply for parole and go before a parole board. You guys understand what parole means?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's when you're released early, usually because you served a chunk of your time, but not the whole time. So parole would mean like, hey, this person hasn't been a problem. They seem like they really regret what they did. And typically, you're not talking about like violent offenders here. You're talking about maybe somebody that stole a car, something like that. You steal a car, you're sentenced to 2 years in jail or something like that. You serve a year, maybe you can be up for parole, where you're kind of like on probation, right? If you get parole, you have to check in with a parole officer, and you gotta toe the line, because if you step out of line, they can throw you back in jail for the rest of your term.
What's the difference between that and a house arrest?
You can't leave your house.
Yeah, a house arrest, like your movement is very restricted.
Okay.
In parole, you can go out and be a part of society again. You just have to stay in contact with your parole officer and things like that.
Do you mean unusual?
Cruel and unusual punishment. Cruel and unusual punishment. Thank you, Michael. Cruel and unusual punishment. Basically saying the guards can't abuse you, right? Things like that. Okay, so let's talk about some limits to due process. So now you've got a sense of what due process is. You've got a sense of what are some specific due process rights you have. But there are some instances where due process rights can be limited. And the first one we're going to talk about is particularly applicable to you guys, although maybe not all of you, because some of you might be 18 already, and that is juveniles or minors. Okay? So juveniles don't have the same due process rights that adults do. Okay? And if you don't like the word juveniles, just use the word minors. Okay? It's a little easier to spell. So minors and adults are treated differently, and this goes all the way back to the Progressive era. Right? In the early 1900s, you've got a lot of reforms that are happening. We talked about this very briefly in your 10th grade year. You probably looked at it a little bit more early in the year last year with Ms. Morris. A lot of reforms going on, and one of the reforms that these people were trying to get through was to treat minors and children differently in the legal system than adults. So, for example, minors who are accused of crimes are usually tried in what's called a juvenile court.
Well, doesn't also age count? They for like a certain age, so you can be tried.
Sure, right? That's the whole thing, is it's about age, right? If you are under the age of 18, you are considered a minor, a juvenile. Now, if sometimes somebody does something really bad and they're close to 18, the state might choose to charge them as an adult. So sometimes you see that in the news. So-and-so, 17 years old, blah, blah, did some horrible crime. They're going to be charged as an adult. Meaning that even though they're under the age of 18, they're going to be tried as an adult. And that means that they have a little bit more protections, but it's also going to mean that the punishments can be worse too.
So
Right.
it's like mainly it's like has to do with age, but also in certain situations like that, like the severity of the crime.
Sure, like if you're really close to being an adult, they'll sometimes take that into account.
How do you spell tried?
TRIED.
Okay.
So, if you're a minor, one difference is you will probably be tried in a juvenile court instead of a regular court. Minors typically face less severe penalties if they are convicted. So instead of going to like grown-up, full-on jail, you might get sent to juvenile detention, or maybe a reform school, something like that. So the punishments are usually a little bit less severe. And the Supreme Court has also ruled that some due process rights are not guaranteed for minors. The Supreme Court has said, in particular, they've ruled that minors are not guaranteed a trial by jury.
So does that mean that that you're just not going to have a jury, or would the judge make that?
Means that the judge will make the decision.
Okay.
Right? So minors, their rights might be limited in some situations, but it also means that there's some trade-off there, that the punishments are usually not as severe. Okay? And the court has said those limits are okay. We also know from the New Jersey v. TLO case that students' due process rights can be limited. Okay? There are also limits on students' due process rights. So, for example, in a school setting, right, school officials can punish students without having a trial, right? Like, oh, you're suspended. Oh, no, I want a trial by jury. No, sorry, right? In a school setting, you're a juvenile in a school setting, you don't get the full range of due process rights, okay? But again, the trade-off there is that also means the punishments are usually not as severe either, okay? Now, second area where historically there have been limits is in periods of war. Okay, so there can be limits to due process rights in wartime as well. And so why are there limits? Well, in the Constitution, it actually gives Congress the ability to suspend habeas corpus. Put it back on the board. Congress actually has the ability to suspend habeas corpus in periods of national emergency.
National.
Emergency. Right? Periods of war, periods of, if there's an invasion or rebellion or something like that.
What if there was like a natural disaster that was affecting a majority of the country? Would that be considered?
Again, it's up for Congress to decide. And somebody could challenge it and it could go to the court. But Congress does have the ability to suspend habeas corpus. Meaning they could put people in prison and they don't have to put them in front of a judge right away. They can keep them locked up, not forever, but they can suspend it for a time. And so that's like an extreme example, and it's very rare, but it has happened. It happened during the Civil War.
Oh yeah.
Right? It happened during the Civil War. A second limit, potential limit, and again, this is also kind of an extreme example, but it has been in the news recently, has to do with the term enemy combatant. And this gets to the point that wars don't really look like what they used to. When we think of war, we think of, okay, there's one country's army on one side and another country's army on the other side, and they fight each other. That's a war.
But it's not
But look at who the United States has been fighting recently.
Mexico.
Mexico?
No, where is it?
ISIS,
ISIS.
the Taliban, Al-Qaeda. These aren't countries,
They're groups.
right? So there have been instances where we have actually caught U.S. citizens fighting against us, right? They have been fighting for the Taliban or for Al-Qaeda, and we've captured those U.S. citizens. And the question is, well, in such a situation, do they forfeit some of those due process rights? Because they're what's called an enemy combatant. Like, hey, wait a minute, so they're fighting against us, but they're still a U.S. citizen, right? There's some questions there that the court has to deal with of, does that U.S. citizen then forfeit some of their due process rights?
So would they do some due process?
It's not really clear, right? There's only been a couple of cases where this has kind of come up. And so the court hasn't really, to my knowledge, really drawn a very clear line on this issue. So due process rights are limited for juveniles. They can also be limited in periods of war. All right, last thing we're going to talk about here, last couple of minutes. 2 criticisms about due process. And they're kind of opposites here. So the first criticism comes from people who say that our due process rights are too strict. They say our due process rights are too strict and it's blocking police from being able to do their jobs effectively. The second main criticism is the flip. Others argue that our due process rights are not enforced strictly enough.